This is the Be One Change One podcast, where our mission is to help listeners define values, practice integrity, and inspire change.
Our vision is to mentor men and empower them to achieve more by taking responsibility for shaping their own lives.
He's CAS, an evolving man who has been shaped by adversity and continues to grow through his imperfections.
And he's Roscoe, an imperfect work in progress that tries to suck less every day.
Between us, we have over 40 years of Air Force fighter pilot experience with countless hours as trainers, instructors, and mentors.
Join us and learn to take responsibility for your own life as we dive into subjects from leadership to resilience to vulnerability.
Be the one who changes their course. Be decisive, driven, and purposeful. Set the example for others. Lead. We wish we'd had this show when we were younger men.
Be the one.
Matt Sucka / Meta Deitz, we're going to get into that right off the bat, is our guest today. Sucka and I have known each other for going on 20 years. It's close. Although there's been some large breaks in there, but we've maintained contact. We've known each other for a long time. Met in 2007, I think, in Seymour Johnson out of the Eagles. And you took an interesting course, man. We flew together for a little while, and then you kind of branched off and got into academia, and I'm really interested in that and how that all came about and what that journey was like, because it's, I would say, maybe slightly atypical. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I joke often that if I were going to write a biography about my life, it would be called The Accidental Historian.
Right on.
You know, because really all I ever wanted to do growing up as a kid was fly airplanes. And so, I do that mostly. And when I was in college, I tried to be an aero engineer, and that went very poorly for me. And so I had to change my major to something that I could actually get a degree in and survive college before I failed out. And history, it turned out I was pretty good at. So I got a history degree. And then same kind of thing, the Air Force, as you move along through the Air Force is like, hey, we want you to get an advanced degree so you can get promoted and all those things. And so I started looking for what I was going to do. And a lot of guys were getting MBAs and stuff. And I looked into that and realized that I was going to have to take more undergraduate level classes to be able to even get into an MBA program that I was, just to get a degree in history. So I got a master's degree in history, just more to check the box than anything else, and sort of set that aside for a while. And then I got a random email one day. I was after I left the Strike Eagle, I went to the Introduction to Fighter Fundamentals course, and as an instructor there, which was a great time. All the good things about flying fighter airplanes without all the 2-hour-long debriefs and stuff. So, that was good. But I got an email that said, "Hey, have you ever thought of teaching history at the Air Force Academy? You fit the mold." And I was like, man, I don't know anything about this. Tell me more. And so, back and forth a few emails, and I applied for the program, and AFPC said, sorry, man, you're a fighter pilot. We don't let fighter pilots go do that kind of stuff. And so the sort of backdoor deal was, well, do you want to go get a PhD instead? The Air Force Academy offered me a PhD slot. And I was like, but sure, why not? Why, I don't know. Do you want me to? And they said yes. And I said, sure, let's do that. So, it worked out from a family perspective, timing wise. And so I went and got a PhD, and here I am. Been doing that.
You say it just so nonchalant, I just went over there and got a PhD, no big deal.
I had no idea what I was getting myself into at the time, but it's turned out to be really good. Kind of in between when I left, in between when I finished my master's degree and went about my flying life, I had worked at a NATO staff job, and that really got me into foreign policy and that kind of stuff a little deeper than I did before. So my PhD is sort of a history, foreign policy mashup. It's technically military history, policy, and strategy, or something like that. So, it sounds very official, but it's really just like me doing the things that I already like doing anyway.
Well, that's fun.
Yeah.
So at some point in there, we got to kind of dive into this, because I'm genuinely curious, and it's going to highlight a couple of things, I'm sure. But we got to talk about this transition from Sucka to Meta.
Yeah.
And it's funny, haha, and everything. But I mean, that was kind of a bruise on what I would say is a bruise on maybe our leadership at the time. And I think it's been maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years or so since there was, since all that was kind of going down, and there was this knee jerk reaction across the Air Force. And I mean, from your point of view, man, because you were probably affected by it more than CAS or I. I mean, I didn't have to change my call sign.
Yeah, neither did I.
And develop this new identity. So just right off the bat, man, let's go into that real quick, just so we can clear the mud, and really more so just to satisfy my own curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, just like you guys know, the Air Force went through a period of, and for a lot of, I think, good reasons, or at least good motivations in some ways, right? But maybe the execution of the plan was not as smooth as it could have been. But it was, just sort of like randomly declared one day that these following people who were on this list need to change their call sign, and Sucka was on that list. And so it was funny. I was at Mountain Home at the time, flying with the Tigers, and we just sort of like convened a meeting of all the bros in the vault, and we were like, all right, these 4 people or whatever have to change their call sign. And so they just started going down the line, like, all right, who do you want to be now? Like, what do you want your call sign to be, basically, which is a little bit antithetical to how you get a call sign to begin with, right? Like,
I was gonna say that sounds very against the grain, for sure.
A little bit just like go down the line and be like, all right, what do you want your call sign to be at this point? Because everybody involved, everybody involved at this point was reasonably senior, had been around for a while, and so all of us had, as it were, flown in combat with our name, and so changing it was sort of like, I don't know that we want to do this. And so sort of as a joke, I said I wanted to be Ron Artest. And if you know anything about anything, Ron Artest, of course, NBA basketball player in the 2000s ish era, and at one point after several midlife crises, he changed his name to Meta World Peace. And so I said I wanted to be Ron Artest because he changed his name, and now that name was open. And so then they were like, "No, man, you can't be Ron Artest. Like, you're gonna be Meta. Meta World Dietz was kind of like the way that it initially came out." So
that's funny.
That's awesome.
So,
actually,
it just got shortened down to Meta, which I think is funny. And then one of the funnier things that came out, of course, is now Facebook is Meta, of course, and a bunch of the people that worked for me got me a name tag that says Facebook now. Nice. So I kind of, I've sort of taken over that name too. So,
that's awesome.
Great.
But yeah, my wife likes Meta a lot better. It's a more publicly acceptable name, I guess,
probably.
right?
That makes sense.
There's something in there though, and then I'll give it to you in just a second, CAS. But I don't want this to get missed on the listeners. Is our community, the fighter pilots, I mean, we are tier 1, top level, like 100% committed to being as awesome at our job as any other tier 1 level championship level team, right? But at the same time, you have to balance that with a lot of humor, man. And I think that's the one thing. And some of that humor gets really dark sometimes. Like on a long deployment, there's some dark humor in there. But I think that's what keeps things, I don't know, maybe in balance a little bit. You work hard, play hard kind of mentality.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, Meta, I was just curious, man, just going back to your transition into kind of the academic world, right? Because I think what most people, we've talked about this with a few other guests that we've had on the podcast that kind of had, kind of a different career path than the standard fighter pilot goes. But, the military, for the listeners out there, the military, you kind of have a specific route that you kind of follow, for the most part, as you go through the ranks and, through different leadership positions and stuff like that. But going back to that transition from like IFF and initially going, hey, maybe I'll go back and do some academic stuff. What was that transition like for you, man? Was it kind of scary? Were you worried? Were you, like what were some of the obstacles that you faced in that, or some of the fears that you had to confront in that, to kind of take that leap and to make that complete pivot from, dude, I'm a fighter pilot flying jets to now I'm going to go get a PhD. Like that's a big
Right.
pivot.
It is, you know, and frankly, I mean, I'd always assumed that I would, you know, serve my time in the Air Force and then go fly for the airlines someday, you know. So like, not only was this off the normal Air Force path, but it was like a 90-degree turn from the direction that I thought I was going as a human, you know. And so that that part of it was pretty intimidating, to be like, well, what am I going to do now? And what does my future look like? So that, you know, it was a little bit sort of like jumping off into the unknown.
Yeah.
From that perspective.
Yeah, because I think people don't realize too, like that the Air Force in some respects, like the different, like things are different. When you're in the fighter pilot community, there's kind of a, you know, like a specific course you follow. There's, and if once you've been in the game long enough, you kind of know what that is, right? So you kind of know what to expect.
Right.
You kind of know what's coming next. But when you jump off of that and you go over to kind of Big Blue, that's like a whole different world, right?
Yeah, it really was. And frankly, you know, like, I mean, there's almost no two communities that are less compatible with each other than fighter pilots and academics. You know, I mean, I hate to say it that way. Not to say that fighter pilots aren't like naturally curious and intelligent and like life learners, right? Like, I think to be successful at being in the community that we are from, you have to be willing to learn and grow and do a lot of things that most people are not willing to do. But sort of to Roscoe's point a second ago, you know, that there's also like a hard edge to it, you know, that that just sort of comes with being in the business. Yeah. And so, and academia, of course, is not really hard edged from that perspective, you know. So that part of it too was also a little bit of an adapting, you know, just like, and then in the middle of all of that, you know, I went to a they just let me go to school. Like,
where'd you go to school?
And I was a college student. What's that?
Where'd you get your PhD at?
I got my PhD at University of North Texas.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, they just were like, what school do you want to go to? And I was like, wow, this sounds good to me. And like, they had a good military history program, and so that's where I ended up going. I really enjoyed it there. It was an awesome time, but it was weird, man. I went from being like, you know, the DO of a fighter squadron to a college kid.
Yeah.
In like 3 weeks, you know. Like,
those are two very distinct. There's a tremendous dichotomy between those two.
Right. Yes. You know, it was a distinct hard break from the community for sure. But also, you know, it was a good chance to like sort of broaden perspective a little bit, and see how other people live and interact with people in a way that I'd never really done before. You know, moving around, even though you may meet civilian friends along your path, you know, you're always living in a military town for the most part, right?
Yeah.
And so I hadn't really had the experience of doing that. I did a little bit when I was in my NATO job because we lived in Italy, and so, you know, that foreign experience was somewhat of that, but still, you know, I was close to military folks most of the time. So just being like the only military guy in the room a lot of times was, you know, I was almost like a museum experiment, you know, a museum exhibit for some people, you know, where they were like they would ask me a bunch of questions about like, what did you do and why and how, and, you know, all those things. So that part of it was interesting, but it definitely was just a jump off the deep end a little bit.
We've heard this story before.
Yeah.
We've heard this story before from another guest, one in particular, but I experienced this when I went up. I took my son to Embry-Riddle last year. He just started his sophomore year, but last year when he was starting as a freshman, we stopped by the, I don't know what they called it. I guess it was like the Veterans Help or Veterans Assistance or something like that. Little shop there, and there was a staff sergeant and a tech sergeant. They were separated. They were just, you know, normal civilian dudes by this point, but those two guys and I had this quick conversation, and he says, yeah, man, he says, our job here really is to help these kids, these people who have separated from the Air Force, and help them assimilate into like normal life, because we take for granted, I think, a lot of times throughout our careers, how we just kind of get pigeonholed into this, into these communities, and you accept that, and you look around, and your friend group, your entire friend group is like you. We're all kind of
Right.
self-starter, type A, kind of get the job done kind of dudes. We're all educated men, for the most part, ladies. And when you step away from that and you realize, man, we are a very, very small percentage of the overall population. And a lot of times we find it very difficult to communicate with those people because of that. There's this gap between those two populations.
Yeah. I mean, I've almost in some ways like had to learn a whole new way of talking.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, just obviously, like fighter pilots, we have our own language. There's that part of it too. But like, we also tend to be very direct. We don't pull a lot of punches.
Not everybody appreciates that.
We're not afraid of leaning into like heavy problems and like facing controversies sort of directly. Yeah. Even if you're engaging with, somebody who's outranks you, like your squadron commander or somebody like that, and you're being respectful and all that stuff, you still, I think, a lot of times will lean very passionately and directly into those disagreements. And not everybody does that. Like you said, Roscoe, like not everybody appreciates that level of directness or that level of feedback. And it took me a while to like learn to filter that a little bit. To learn that, like, I can't just say the things that pop directly into my brain, you know?
Well, we're afforded an opportunity to take the gloves off in the debrief too, right. And it doesn't matter if you got a 2-star general in the room or a butt of bar lieutenant, man, the gloves are off, and whoever's got the pens has the voice, and right. That's not always the case in the civilian world.
Yeah. And interestingly, like the other day I was having a conversation with my class about experience. We do what we call War Story Fridays here at the Air Force Academy, and so I try to share with the students like something that I've learned throughout my time, and I was talking through a story that happened a long time ago in a galaxy far away, and I got to the end, and then we talked through the debrief and that kind of stuff of what happened. And they said, well, who was in charge of doing that debrief, and who was there, and like who was critiquing you for the decisions that you made? And I said, well, me. Like I was the flight lead at the time. Like I was the guy given the debrief. I was the guy critiquing. And he said, well, how do you critique yourself? And I'm like, well, you have to be just as honest about your own performance as you are about those in your team. And because if you're not, you don't have that same level of credibility. So I think people miss that a lot of times, is that my own worst critic is often me. And just because I'm critiquing the thing that you do or giving you feedback doesn't mean that I'm not also doing that same thing for me.
Hey, Sucka, do me a favor, dude, and move like 4 inches to your left. We're getting like half of your face on the screen. There you go. Perfect. Right there.
Excellent.
Right, go ahead, Cass. Sorry. That was bugging the shit out of me.
No, it's cool. So Meta, like when in that transition though, brother, was there like did you feel unprepared, like going back to school at all, or because you had done a master's? Like I would imagine, because like I know when I went to Naval Postgraduate School, like dude, I hadn't been a student in 10 years, 11 years, 12 years, and now all of a sudden, I'm writing 30-page research papers and having to do all this reading and studying, and and it takes a little bit of while to get back in the groove. And I know for me going back into it, I'm like, man, am I going to be able to do this again? Like, am I going to be able to write the level that they want me to? And
there is definitely some of that. Yeah, for sure. I tell people it's reading and writing is like working out. It's like a muscle.
Is.
You can't just like pick it up and do it proficiently. And I would say I struggled my first semester or so there to keep up, with my coursework. And it's, it was nice because I didn't have anything else to do. Like the Air Force is paying me my normal salary to like go to school, and so I had no other responsibilities other than doing that, and I still struggled to like keep my coursework up. And so I had to quickly adapt to reading and writing hundreds of pages at a time, and then just like the quality of my writing and my ability to like articulate what I wanted to say in a understandable way through writing was really a challenge that, I got a B in my very first class. It was the only B I got in my PhD, and the feedback was basically like, well, the writing wasn't so good, but you made a good point. So like, I guess you'll get a B, like your argument was good, but your writing was bad. So it balances out to a B, so, but I think one semester I figured that I read somewhere in the neighborhood of like 20,000 pages of reading, and I wrote somewhere like north of 300 pages of writing just in like a 3-month semester. And that learning curve and that pace of being able to do that consistently was challenging, and something that I was not able to do right at the beginning. Because same thing, like I hadn't done anything academic in a decade when I showed up for my PhD.
Yeah. Well, see, I think that's important, man, because I think a lot of times when people face the decision to make a pivot like that, especially kind of as extreme as yours was, right? Like, I think oftentimes what prevents them from doing that is kind of the fears, those fears of the unknown. Like, what am I really getting myself into? Do I have the capabilities and the skills to actually do what maybe I'm shifting over towards? But the bottom line is you're probably more capable than you think you are. And, if you go into it with the right mindset, and tell me if you agree with this, but it sounds like in your case as well, if you go into it with the right mindset, and then you just stay curious and you learn from people around you, you learn skills, like when I got to Naval Postgraduate School, because we had a ton of reading every night too, one of the first things that I learned to do was, when I had 500 pages of shit to read tonight, you take a 25-page paper that they want you to read, and the first thing you do is you go to the conclusion and you find out what the 3 main points are, right? And then you just kind of skim through first sentence, last sentence of every paragraph to figure out, okay, is this paragraph fluff, or is he actually getting to one of the main points here or not, right? And that's how you can get through stuff really fast. So, you pick up skills if you pay attention, you pick up skills and all those types of things throughout the process that, then you can kind of build upon, where you screw up, you take the lessons learned, you reapply them to the next time, and you press and you move forward. Is that kind of was that what your experience was like?
Yeah, definitely. And I recently I heard somebody, I don't even remember who it was, and so I'm gonna quote them, and then I'm not gonna be able to tell you who it was, but it's something on Instagram I saw, and it was like, don't expect to be good at something the first time you do it, right? Like if you find somebody that is excellent at something, just remember that at some point they were bad at it.
It takes reps, man.
And it took them a hot minute to like get to where they are. You have to go through the iterations of practicing your craft, right, to get better at it. And if you don't, you never will. And you have to be willing to fail and suck and struggle a little bit to like be good at the thing that you do. And even I tell people that like one of the only like natural talents I have is flying airplanes, believe it or not. It's just one of those things that like I can actually do it naturally without a lot of effort. But even that, I still wasn't like a top tier fighter pilot when I first started flying airplanes. Like I still had to go through all the growing pains of hooking rides and doing all that stuff, like everybody else does that, and you don't get to be excellent at what you do. Even if you have a skill for it, you don't get to be excellent at what you do unless you kind of struggle through all the learning process to go through there.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes talent only gets you in the door.
Right.
And maybe it doesn't even get you in the door. Maybe it just cracks that door open just a little bit. Like you can see this. I coached football for a really long time, and you can see this with young kids as early as 7 or 8 years old. You can see the talented athletic kids, right? But if they don't turn that talent into skill and develop that through a lot of hard work and consistency, then that talent's really not going to do any good for them. They'll be decent basketball players in the gym when they're 25 years old, and they go hang out with their bros and stuff. They might win a couple of games of 21 here or there. But if you don't really hone that, look at the Steph Currys of the world, man. The guy shoots 500 3-pointers every day of his adult life, something like 3 million 3-pointers the guy shot. And now now as an adult, he's arguably the best pure shooter in the game. But that started when he was, 15, 16, 17 years old. That
Right.
consistency over time, and I was on a podcast just a couple of weeks ago, and the guy asked me, he says, what does it mean to be a champion? How do you become a champion? Like, what are the ingredients here? And I said, dude, you have to have a passion for it first, because if you don't have a passion for it, it'll always be work. I'm going through this right now with my son who wants to be a fighter pilot. I said, dude, this has to be all consuming for you, or else it's always going to be work and you're never really going to enjoy it. The second thing is you have to develop the skill around it. You have to put in the time to develop the skill. Playing my guitar, I sucked at it for a really long time, but I developed the skill over a lot of reps, and then finally you have to have consistency, and you have to do this for a really long time. The example is, Thomas Edison and the light bulb. He says, well, I didn't fail 10,000 times. I figured out 10,000 ways to not make a light bulb. But he needed that. He only needed that one time, and those 10,000 reps is what got him to that one point. Michael Jordan's famous for having quotes around this and all that.
Kobe.
But what you were talking about earlier, man, that pivot into academia, and I knew that this is where this conversation was going to go, and you two were going to have a nerd off, and I was just going to sit back, and because I'm not an academic, right? And I don't operate in that language, but the themes are the same, right? And the big theme here is get out of your comfort zone. Don't be afraid to try new things and do hard shit. And that's what will get you ahead in life.
And then work really hard at it. I think the other thing that's really cool about your story too, Meta, is like one thing that you talked about, we're just talking about was, when you got there, you recognize that, some of those, like the soft skills, we're not really taught soft skills in a fighter squadron, like how to approach people, that kind of emotional intelligence side of things, kind of a little more social awareness. We're just kind of brash and rough, and that's just how it is. But like, I think another lesson behind your story too is we had a whole podcast just a couple of weeks ago on being trainable, right? And learning how to be adaptable. And so, you got to realize too, when you get into those environments, staying curious, keeping your mouth shut and listening, right? Know your role and shut your hole type of thing. Well, it can be very positive because it allows you to pick up a certain amount of adaptability in the sense that you can kind of start to figure out, okay, how do I need to operate in this world? Like, I know it's different. And so, it gives you some space to kind of figure out what are the boundaries, what are the rules, maybe every once in a while I overstep. Okay, that's a check for me. Now I know. But like, I love that piece of it, man, because I think sometimes people just, Roscoe likes to say all the time, well, that's the way my daddy did it, so that's the way I'm going to do it. And it's like, dude, you got to, you know what, if you're going to go explore the things, you've also got to be willing to shift some of your own perceptions, right? Like recognize that there are other truths that exist in the world outside of the little realm that you've been living in. And whatever you believed or the way that you behaved in that realm doesn't translate or work in another one, right? And you just have to learn how to be flexible and adaptable in that sense. You want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, for sure. I think, one of the most translatable skills that I learned as a fighter pilot was being able to take feedback from all quarters, right? Like, to kind of what Roscoe hinted on earlier is like whoever's got the pins owns the debrief, and that person may be older than you and that person may be younger than you, but they are still, recognized as the expert in that field. And I think from that perspective, it really helped me, even now, I'm as the head of the history department, right? I'm still learning how to lead organizations that, that are totally foreign to me in a lot of ways, and so being able to take feedback even, from people that work for me. Technically I'm their boss, right? And I tell them all the time, I'm like, look, man, my door is open 90% of the time, right? And if it's open, you can come in and tell me almost anything, and then if you have some feedback for me, if there is something that I am doing or not doing, then that I need to know about, then please come and tell me, because if I'm making that mistake and it's negatively impacting the success, your individual success or the success of the organization, then I need to know that as the leader of that organization or as your boss, so that I'm not the impediment.
Yeah, that's awesome, man.
To that, and I think that the ability to take that feedback, no matter who's giving it, you know, and now granted, right, you don't always agree,
Sure.
nor do you always have to like do what that person says, because sometimes, you know, people, they have their own perspective and they're just bringing their perspective to you so that you can be aware of it and it's useful. It may not be the path that you travel as a person or as an organization,
Sure.
but at least hearing that feedback as a possibility, I think, is helpful.
No, absolutely, man. I think that's something that gets missed in leadership so much, right? Because your job as a leader is to make the final decision, but it's not necessarily for you to have the decision. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like you may, if you're smart about leadership, you will always seek feedback and input from the people around you, especially if they're more directly tied to whatever the issue is, because they may have better perspective. They may see, you know, a contingency that you don't see. They may see something, you know, down the road, the second and third order effects that maybe you're not aware of, right? And so I think it's always good to get feedback. Ultimately you make the decision, and sometimes we disagree, and sometimes you just have to say, well, you know, I understand your point of view, but I've got to make the decision, and we're going to move in this direction, and that's fine, right? But I think seeking that feedback and stuff is super important.
Yeah. And you know, being in academia, and I mean, similarly, a friend of mine who was a Navy pilot, he often jokes that, you know, if you wanted to learn how to do something, just had to walk into the squadron and you could probably find somebody that would like be able to program, like build an app, you know, like program a website, rebuild the engine on your Chevy, like, you know, like grow a garden, right? Like there's somebody in every squadron that like knows how to do something, right? And I feel kind of the same way in academia, right? Like there's so many people that are so smart and know so many things about so many things that I don't know about, that it's almost like every day a little adventure to find out, like, what am I going to learn about today?
Yeah.
You know, you know, like, and I think that like being willing to learn something every day, it is probably the hardest skill to acquire. Because most people are like sort of happy in their life the way that it is, you know, like this is my life, and you know, and I even went through seasons of that in my life where I was just like, this is how it is, and I am happy right where it is, and I don't want it to change in any way, and I don't want it to be upset in any way. And I found that usually those weren't very satisfying times in my life, you know, like when I was learning and changing and facing some adversity, oftentimes those were, you know, really good times in my life.
Well, what you guys just described inadvertently really is that whole humble, approachable, credible loop, right? The humility it's displayed there by your curiosity and your openness and willingness to learn new things and ask questions and be genuinely, you know, engaged in whatever it is, you know, admit in front of everyone that you don't have the answer, but maybe you know where to find it, and admit when you're having a conversation that that person might know more about the subject than you. That's humility in a nutshell, right? And we say all the time here that humility is a superpower, and once you get to the point where you can raise your hand and say I don't know or I fucked up, then you've opened up a new door to a whole new world out there.
Yeah.
And that world is full of knowledge and instruction and mentorship and all these cool things, man. But you have to first be willing to say that. You have to first be willing to open yourself up to that stuff. The credibility comes from the learning of the new things, right? You're just building your knowledge base and you're able to pass that on to other people. And then finally that accountability, or the approachability piece of it is, you know, you gave the example of having your door open, like, please come give me feedback, man. And when they do give you feedback, whomever it is, whether it's your wife or your college students, don't turn around and bite their head off, because now they don't want to come and give you that feedback again. What I really wanted to ask you though was, when somebody does give you feedback, how important do you think it is to weigh that and consider that source? You know, because I say two things about feedback. First of all, consider the source, right? If it's a rando troll on Facebook, probably doesn't have the same weight as maybe CAS does or my wife does. You know, somebody who really knows me and knows my intentions and knows, you know, maybe I just didn't communicate something correctly or whatever. But the other question I have to ask is he right? He might be a troll on Facebook and he might be very critical of whatever it is, but he also might be right. But how important is it to weigh that, and where's the balance in there?
Yeah. I mean, that is a good way to look at it, right? like, obviously, I think most of us have, mentors and advisors, i.e., people that are close to us, that whose advice we trust and will take at almost any cost, right? Like I will take my wife's advice, 99 times out of 100, um, because she knows me and she knows the things that I can and can't do well and things that make me happy and don't make me happy, right? And she knows the impact of those decisions on me and my family and all those things, right? And so I trust her advice over almost anybody's, right? Um, and then you sort of work out from there. Internet trolls, for what they're worth, they'll give you great advice, but but can it be trusted, right? Is it the best? And I think the key there is like, what is this person's perspective, and how many miles have they earned with you, in giving this advice, right? Like, obviously my wife and I have earned a lot of miles together, so she gets extra credit in that way, right? And so you do have to take into account, like, what's the relational weight here? How much can I trust this person's advice? But also is like, what is their level of expertise? My wife doesn't know anything about cars, and so it would be maybe a bad choice to trust her on, like, rebuilding an engine. But there are other people that are obviously experts on doing such things, and so they would be more trusted advisors in that way. So you have to weigh that sort of dichotomy of, like, closeness of relationship plus expertise to be able to do that, right? And then the last part is perspective. For example, here where I work, the folks that work for me, they don't always, they don't always have the perspective. I can trust them because we have a close working relationship. They are obviously very intelligent, but they don't always have the full perspective of, like, what's going on from an organizational strategy perspective, right? They often are just doing their thing, at their level, and that's not a knock on them. That's just where they are in their life,
Yeah.
right? And so their perspective is different. So it's not that it's an invalid perspective. It's just not maybe the best perspective of what needs to be decided for an organization strategically,
Yeah.
right? And I think about myself as a captain a lot, when I make decisions, because I'm like, would Captain me say the same thing as Colonel me? And the answer is no, right? Captain me had a very different perspective on life, right? And for a good reason, right? Because Captain me was expected to do certain things and not expected to do other things, right? Colonel me has a lot of different expectations, and so you have to weigh that perspective matters, right? And so those sort of three parts of it is, like, relationship, credibility, and perspective, and sort of balance those three things against each
Yeah,
other.
well, I think the perspective piece is important, man. And I think one thing that it speaks to that we talk a lot about on the podcast is the importance and the value of mentorship, right? Especially if you can find somebody who's kind of ahead of you in the game, maybe already is in a position that you'd like to be in, because they've gone through that process, right? They have that perspective, so they can give you a little peek behind the curtain as to what you need to do, maybe how to position yourself, maybe some things that you need to work on around yourself, some skills that you may need to build in order to kind of move forward into that, because perspective is so important.
Yeah, agreed, for sure. And
But there's something else there, man, and like, the Colonel in you has to make certain decisions a certain way, but I think this is something that always frustrated me, man, when I was on active duty. And brother, I was 8 years enlisted and then 13 years as an officer, right? So I've seen both sides of this in completely different ways and completely different environments, right? But this is something that always frustrated me, is when guys further up the chain make these decisions and they totally disregard the point of view of the guys that are down below them, right? And so I really wish that some of these guys would go and sit down with the captains and the lieutenants and go, hey guys, like, give me your perspective on this. And we were kind of joking before we got started. We're back to no Friday name tags and no colored shirts and stuff, because some general up the chain thought it was a great idea for us to all look uniform. Well, okay, first of all, does that even fucking matter? And then second of all, what's that really doing, man? Like, you're gonna you're running a risk of completely destroying culture and a lot of the reasons and a lot of the underlying values that some of these guys hold dear, and give them the reason to get up in the morning and go to work because they're part of something. They're part of a fraternity, right? You're willing to squash that because you have, I don't know, a vendetta or a better idea or whatever it is. Like sit down and put yourself in Captain Dietz's in chair and go back to that
Right.
time. And would Captain Dietz say, this is dumb as fuck? Right. And I don't know. I mean, because dude, we've all been there, right? You've been in charge of shit where you have to look at it and go, this is fucking stupid. But if I don't make this decision, my bosses are going to shit on me for doing,
Right.
So it's not as easy as it looks, I guess. But man, I wish that sometimes we could go back to just 03 Roscoe and throw shit in the bar and sing a song and go home.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, the world is more complex sometimes than I imagined it was when I was a captain. And that is true, right? Like in my experience, it was all, it was often challenging to like see what is the point of what we're doing, and I will tell you honestly, like even now, I think this is a hard part of being a leader of an organization of any size is everybody has a boss, right? Like even CEOs of big companies, right? If you're a large publicly traded company, like your boss ultimately is the shareholders, right? And so you answer to that machine in some way. And so, a lot of times you find yourself caught in between the, like, what does Captain Me want to do? And what is my boss telling me to do? And now I have to make a decision that's sort of, it's satisfying to nobody, really, really in the end, and sometimes, it seems to me that people are making decisions based off their own personal preferences. And they're just like saying, we're going to do this as an organization. And then, I have to then carry that news to the people that work for me and explain to them, like, I don't know, right? Like I listened to your feedback and I gave feedback where it was appropriate to do so. But like, this was the decision that was made, and I have no idea how we came to that decision, but I have to now execute it. So sorry, man. Like, I don't know what we're going to do now, so let's just buckle up our boots and go on our merry way, and I think that part of it, sometimes is challenging, right? Is to be like, well, I gave my feedback and they didn't listen, and now I have to do the thing that I didn't want to do to begin with. And it sucks. Like that part of it sucks a lot. Sometimes you can see the sort of like strategy behind it. But sometimes not at all. Right. And I get, like, you talk about uniforms. One of the things I joked about the other day is like, I mean, I don't care, right? Like if I wear blue shirts or black shirts or brown shirts, like whatever, I get to fly fighters, right? Even as a captain, I sort of was like, whatever, I don't care what color my boots are.
Yeah.
I just want to go fly fighter airplanes, right? Like that's all I want to do. And so as long as you're letting me do that, I'm happy. But there also is a element of like, this is my place. This is these are my people, and we belong in this tribe. And this is the identifier of my tribe, right? Like back to the conversation about call signs or whatever, right? This is the identifier of my identity in this tribe. And the fact that I have to change it is hard. And I don't understand it always, and so that part of it, I think sometimes is like, even now, right? Like it's lost on Colonel Me. And I think the difference between Captain Me and Colonel Me is that Captain Me would, throw something in the bar and be like, this is a bunch of bull. And like, I'm getting out of here. Right. Like, screw this place. I'm out. And Colonel Me is like, well, man, all right. Like I sort of sometimes have to resign myself to like, this is the way that the organization is that I live in. And so, I just have to, like, if I want to keep doing the thing that I'm doing that I like, I kind of have to put up with it.
That's a certain amount of maturity and experience.
It is an answer.
Yeah, that's just a little bit of maturity and experience and patience, though. I think it just comes with time.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes you just have to embrace the suck, man. I had 3 big rules that I kind of lived by in the Air Force. And the first one was you can't fix stupid. The second one was never go full retard, which which we probably can't say anymore, but I love that show. So Tropic Thunder, here we go. And then the last one was
we're bringing it back.
And then the last one was embrace the suck, right? Like sometimes people are going to make decisions above you. There's nothing you can do about it. All you can do is try to make it as good for the folks that you have control over and that are around you that you have influence over, right? That's all you can do. It's just there's things that are outside of your control, and you can sit there and bitch and moan and have a pity party, but guess what? It's not going to fucking change, right? So all you're doing is wasting energy. So just figure out how to get through it and how to make it as good as you can for the folks around you. Impress. That's all you can do, man. Sometimes things suck.
Right.
Yeah, and what we were talking about earlier about kind of blowing off steam or laughing and having that dark humor and stuff like that. There's another balancing tool, and it's just sport pitching, man. Sometimes sport pitching is, a certain amount of sport pitching is healthy, sitting around the ADO shack and just complaining about what the OG's doing or whatever, and I would put most of that into there. What I used to say back in the day when I was crewing jets was they used to get onto us every now and then about where we wore our line badges. Like it needs to be on your upper left arm or around a lanyard, blah, blah, blah. And I was, I would tell my troops under me, I'd be like, dude, as long as they're bitching about where I'm wearing my line badge, we're not crashing airplanes.
We're doing good.
This is good, right? So if we're bitching about Friday shirts and stupid name tags,
that's where they're putting their efforts.
We're killing Chinese
or
whatever it is. So we're doing the right things.
That's right.
If that's all they've got to complain about, we're not crashing airplanes and creating safety reports.
Yeah. I will say, on the one hand, I do get some level of like, if you're going to be a part of a professional organization, you got to look the part of being in a professional organization, and there is some of the like theory of broken windows, that sort of goes into this. Like if you're going to let some windows be broken, then like where do you draw the line, right? It's the whole slippery slope argument of like sticking to the rules and being part of the organization. And I do understand that on some level. Like you do have to like mind the broken windows a little bit, like because as the famous Challenger accident report, the term normalization of deviance, right, where the tiny little slips in normal protocol led to this like ever increasing pile.
It became more and more acceptable over time.
Slips. Right. And I can see that logic of like, well, if I let this happen, then the odds of that other thing happening, right? And as a leader of a large organization, it becomes sort of like, at what point do I have to like put the brakes on that normalization of deviance, and where do I draw the line?
And I understand that to a certain extent, but I think where you get in trouble with that argument is when it comes to the perception or the reality of incongruence, right? And so, for example, right? So fighter pilots don't wear Friday t-shirts, but dude, you can have as many fucking tattoos as you want.
Right.
So, where's the professional standard at? Or, like it still freaks me out when I go on base every once in a while and see females with ponytails, and it's not a bad look. It's but I'm used to seeing the high and tight for 20 years. That's all I saw. Very clean, very professional, and so the beard things, the Air Force has lax rules in a lot of ways, and some of them for good reason, right? Like shaving waivers and all that stuff. There's people that legitimately need that, but it's weird to see, and a lot of it I'm sure is cultural too, right? And some of it probably to a certain extent is just being able to get new recruits in, right? Maybe have to change some standards just because of cultural expectations and what's acceptable and cultural now, especially like around tattoos and things like that, in order to still get people in the door. But it can give a perception of incongruence, right? Or like targeting or things like that. And I think that's where it gets a little complicated and weird sometimes.
No, I agree. And I think, kind of to Roscoe's point about like, this is our business and sometimes it's dark and sometimes it's happy. And, and we have this sort of weird culture that celebrates that, right? Like one of the things that I liked about being at Seymour Johnson, for example, when I was there, and I was there for a long time, and in most of the squadrons at that base, was they had a deep and very colorful history, right? And they had started as RAF squadrons, and so that gave them this like rich history. And so, in my opinion, if you want to like get people to invest in an organization, you have to like promote that rich history. And I think that at Seymour, at least when I was there, that was one thing that we did really well, was promote that history of what the organization was, where it came from, and why it was this excellent organization. My kid and I were my son and I were having a conversation yesterday, and I know that University of Texas beat Michigan down pretty bad yesterday in football, but like, I was like, I will always give Michigan the benefit of a doubt. Why? Well, because even in seasons where they're not that great of a football team, they have this legacy of excellence, right? Like you can say the same thing about Alabama and like tons of other organizations, right? Like the New York Yankees, whatever, right? Like they have a legacy of excellence. And so because they have a legacy of excellence, they're going to, at some point, win a game, right? Like they're going to, and probably a bunch of them, right? Like the chances of them coming back around to being competitive for a championship are high because that's the way their organization is oriented, right? And I think if you, kind of to your point, Roscoe, if you start chucking over some of these things that are like deeply ingrained into an organization's history, you run the risk of losing that championship mystique.
Well,
and I think if you throw that over the side, then you're in danger of going into a much worse place.
Look at some of those programs though that have that deep history. The Notre Dames, the Michigans, maybe even Ohio State, certainly Bama. There's a few of them out there. You know what they haven't done in the last 100 years? Change their fucking uniforms. Right? Well, because this is the standard. And there's little kids. Dude, there's little kids. Like when we were little kids, we looked to those institutions and we say, man, I want to wear that one day. I want a Wolverine hat or whatever it is. I want a Wolverine jersey, because you knew what that meant. You know what that stood for.
Right.
And what I can't abide, dude, I get it. Social norms are changing, right? It's 2024. It's not 1997 when I enlisted. Things are different. I fully understand that. But what I can't abide is change for the sake of change. I don't give a fuck about the general's OPR bullets. I don't give a shit, man. If there's a good reason why we're doing this stuff, is this going to help us kill Mooj better? Great, let's go do it. But if it's not, then what the fuck are we doing, man?
No, that's fair.
Yeah, that's fair. I think it really goes back to what you said there, Roscoe, which is, we were talking about like legacies of excellence, but you get a legacy of excellence by building a culture of excellence, and you get the culture by having a standard that's set, that's well known, and that standard has to be achieved and maintained in order to move forward. We saw that in fighter squadrons. You see that at the weapons school. And so, I think it's where you start to play with what those standards are and any kind of laxness in those standards where you can get into trouble. But I want to shift, and I want to ask you something, Meta, that's completely different, because you're in a really unique environment at the academy, brother, in the sense that you're seeing this next generation and the folks that are coming up, and they're going to carry that banner forward. Much more so than Roscoe and I are, who, just get exposure to maybe the kids that our kids hang out with or things of that nature. And so I was just curious, man, if you could take a minute and just tell us kind of what's going on with these guys? Like, what's this generation struggle with? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? I know we're kind of talking in generalities, and that's never really probably a good thing, but I'm just curious what your perception is about that.
Yeah, I think I had a conversation with an alumni group a year ago ish now about this very same thing, and one of the things I said was like, while a lot of things have changed, a lot of things are still the same, and the one thing I think that's still the same is like the Air Force Academy, especially, but other places like the Air Force Academy, is the people that come here are motivated to be here, right? Like they're very high achievers to begin with when they walk in the door. And I think by and large, their desire to achieve not just at the Air Force Academy, but beyond this place remains the same, right?
Well, the barrier to entry to the Air Force Academy is so fucking high
Yeah.
that
Right.
you're only going to get the top 1%
Well, that's
anyway.
the standard
Right.
piece, right? So
Yeah. And so like that part of it, I think it doesn't change, right? And so that they want to come here, they want to work hard, they want to exceed the standard by a lot, right? They don't just want to get by, they just want to exceed the standard by a lot, which is encouraging, right? And so for that reason, right, like there's not a lot of difference in that way. But on the other hand, right, I think there's a lot of challenges that they face that, you know, like certainly I never faced back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. You know, like, I mean, just the presence of like social media. And one thing that we don't often think about, like, is because we're so connected all the time with devices and whatnot, like we never really have the chance to unplug. And that is like doubled down on, you know, Air Force Academy cadets or cadets at West Point, because like not only do they rarely get outside the walls of this place, but also like they're always plugged into this place because their peers and their supervisors and their, you know, commanders and stuff always have the ability to sort of like reach into their life because they have those devices with them all the time, right? And so there's this like level of constant connectedness that I think is almost intrusive in some ways, that sort of negates their ability to sort of decompress from what goes on.
It makes it kind of all-consuming.
What goes on. Yeah. On the flip side of that, right, the bad part that comes with that is sort of the like lowered attention span.
Yeah.
You know, so like we were talking about of like learning to be able to read and write in like long stretches at a time, right, is really challenging, right? Because their mediums of communication are quick, they're short, they're in, you know, sentences and photos and that kind of stuff, right? And it's not that they're inarticulate, but they're just not used to articulating themselves in these long format ways, right? And so adapting that and getting them to learn how to communicate in different medium.
Yeah, well,
you know, because
they've done are you familiar
Sorry.
with like attention span versus attention range? Yeah, so like what they of all the research that I've seen, like this generation and probably to the same extent the generation slightly before them, great attention range, right? Ability to multitask, can pay attention to a lot of things, a lot of different things at one time, but their attention range is completely shot, right? Because they've grown up in this environment where, you know, it's you're on your phone, you're on your computer, you're on the television, you're gaming. There's constant, and it's constant information processing, but the ability to take one thing and focus on it for a long amount of time hasn't really been built anymore, which is why I think so many kids kind of struggle with traditional rules in school now, because sitting still for 50 minutes and talking about something is difficult for them.
Cass, I think that right there is maybe one of the keys, man. Is Ice and I were actually just joking around the other day before the pilot showed up to do the mission, whatever mission it was. Ice and I were sitting there joking about Adam Sandler's CDs that he put out in the late 90s. What the hell happened to me? And, you know, Fuck My Car and The Goat and all those. And, you know, when we were growing up, man, all the content was long form content. Like you had to memorize every word of Talladega Nights and Anchorman and Old School, and so that you could sound cool in the debrief, you know. Well, now these young kids, like the guys walked in and I asked the flight lead, he's maybe like, I don't know, 28, 30 years old. I said, hey man, do you know if I said I got fucking no dukes, do you know what that means? And he goes, no, I have no idea, you know. And so yeah, so you know, we were joking about it, but then Ice and I were talking on the back channel during the sim, and we said, man, you know, like I think it's because they get all of their input, all of their programming comes from short form content now, and that's YouTube, that's Instagram Shorts or Reels, that's you know, just cruising the headlines on Yahoo or Google or whatever, and not diving deep into an article and not and that's one great thing about podcasts like this one is you can get long form conversations. I love Joe Rogan for that. Controversial, yes. Very good long form conversations, absolutely, man. So
Yeah.
I mean, the ability to get it is there, but I think the younger generation I think they gravitate towards the short form content a little bit more because it's so rapid fire. Like you can cover so many things in such a short period of time.
Yeah.
And I think that it's, again, it's a learned skill, right? Like they can learn the skill, right? It's just not like what their normal habit
Yeah.
pattern is,
And that's so
And so
important.
it's not like woe is me, all is lost, like that's not the case, right? Um, it's a different way of interfacing with the world, and that's just is how
Yeah.
it is,
Yeah, going back, sorry, I just had a random thought. Going back to that standardization piece, not to shift gears real quick, but one of the things that I just thought about when we were talking about that is just to tie it back to the Be One Change One podcast is, guys, if or gals, listeners, no one's out there, like, this is why setting a personal standard is so important, right? Because you may be in an environment where those standards are maybe not well defined, or maybe ever changing. Or may not exist very much at all. But that's why it's so important to kind of understand your value system and then to set your own personal standards and then to strive towards those personal standards, because most of the time, if you do that correctly, those are going to be above and beyond uh, what the organization standard is. And you probably see that a lot with the kids that you have now, right? Because like you talked about, the standard to get in is pretty high, but they're all very highly motivated, right? So they're going to try to go above and beyond the expectation because they're just driven that way. Would you agree with that?
right? I do agree with that, but still there is a level of like, I mean, and you guys know, right? There is a level of like, if you want to succeed in this world, if you want to be who I was, like the standard, like this is the standard to get in, but the standard to be that and be good is up
Yeah.
here, right? So like, you can't just like rest on, well, I got
you can't
in,
rest on your
so
laurels.
I'm good. Like I have to like keep pursuing that excellence, right? And I think that's also what's hard about doing what we do, or what we did was being able to continuously fight that fight of improvement, right? Like every day go out and be better. And I had a boss, my very first squadron commander was like, he said basically, if I'm not out here learning and getting better, then it's time for me to quit, because that means that I'm no use to anybody.
Yeah.
And I feel that really is the challenge, right? Is like, okay, cool, like great, you got into the Air Force Academy, but now what, right? Because the standard of my organization is even higher than that.
Yeah. Well, I think the flip side to that, what you're talking about, just the desire to strive to get better, to excel, to beat the standard that's been set, or to attain individual goals. Like the flip side of that is that personal accountability you were talking about, right? With the debrief, and you got students going, well, why? How do you hold yourself accountable? Well, dude, if I don't hold myself accountable, I could write a list right now of all the things that I want to achieve in life and the personal standard that I want to set for myself. But if I don't have personal accountability tied to it, it doesn't mean anything. I'm never going to get anywhere.
Right.
Right. So you have to have that accountability. Yeah. You have to have that ability to be self-inspective, to go inside and go, all right, dudes, what am I fucking up? What am I not getting right? And what do I need to change to fix it? What are the skills I like the fact that you specifically stated that, if you suck with attention span, it's a skill. Like you can build it. I mean, there's none of these things are insurmountable obstacles, right? There's a ton of skills that you can build to improve yourself and to get yourself to where you want to be. You just have to put the effort in. You have to do the research. You have to figure it out, talk to people, get the mentor, whatever the case may be, and press and go out and start working at it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as like, if that, like, the two things that I found about myself is one, back to the conversation about PhD stuff was, I found that going to get a PhD allowed me sort of a space to challenge some of my own assumptions about things that I thought and thought that I knew. and bounce those conversations through some pretty smart people, and engage in some open dialogue. And I think that's important, right? Is not only to have mentors who are like you and that you can trust and have been down the path that you are going down, but also to engage with people in ways that are constructive, that are not like you, right? And be able to have those conversations about broad ranging topics, right? And the other one was that Cass, you mentioned about like disciplining, like having your own self-discipline. Like I know this about myself. Like if I don't set my keys down in the same place every time when I come home, like I will lose them, right? Like despite the fact that I am usually like hyper organized, there are some things about me that I know that like this is just my flaw, and I have to like discipline my flaw away basically by
gotta build structure around it sometimes.
Right. Yeah. So
I'm so glad that you guys got there, because one thing that I failed to do as a host was give a proper bio out there for Sucka and the things that he's done. But one of the cool things, man, that I really enjoyed was your Fighter Pilot podcast, or the Fighter Pilot Professor was the podcast name. And it's kind of on pause right now. What we were talking about in the pregame, it's a little bit on pause right now, but new episodes coming hopefully soon. But the structure of it, though, I really like. Cass, you'd really enjoy this, man. It's current/historical events and how they apply today. And then the last few minutes is always like a personal development topic of some sort. And one of those that I just listened to was you were talking about the importance, or lack thereof, of having to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning every day to be this hyper productive person. And I think we can all agree that that's probably a fallacy. It's something that's promoted out there quite a bit. There are goods and bads. If that fits your lifestyle, if that's the kind of person you are, you can get a lot done before 10 o'clock in the morning. Sure. But if your lifestyle isn't conducive, then maybe you have to flex a little bit. Maybe you have to come up with some other productivity method or organizational method to make it work. And I like the way you framed that. Like, if you've got kids in the house and you're committed to these evening events, or, just the general winding down of the house every day, maybe you can't afford to go to bed at 7:30 or 8 o'clock every night. Maybe you owe your kids homework time from 8 to 9 or whatever. And so maybe it's not about getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Maybe it's about having a little structure and organization in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you bring up a good example, like I have high school and college age kids. And so like, my kids are not, they're not even like really getting started until 9 o'clock at night. And so if I were in bed at 9 o'clock at night in order to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning, which I would have to be, right? Because I've learned that about myself, is like one of the things that I need to do is sleep. I need like can I exist with less than 8 hours of sleep? Sure. Am I a highly functioning person without it? No. Right. And so like
not after a couple of days. Nope.
Right. Like I need 7 or 8 hours of sleep pretty regularly. Otherwise, I'm not going to be the best person I can be. And so, if I'm going to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, man, that's an early bedtime. Right. But I can manage to be up a little later and get up a little later, but still sort of discipline my schedule in a way that fits my lifestyle. Right. So I agree that there are good things, right? Like there are good things about getting up and getting your day going at a certain time and being disciplined in that way. But, I find that I get equal benefits, like of my morning routine of like getting up. I get up before everybody in my house. I have coffee. I make coffee for my wife. I read and I do a bunch of things, right? And then like the day starts. And so that little time for me, right, is as important. And it wouldn't matter if I got up at 4 a.m. or 10 a.m. If I can do that little routine, then it sort of sets my day down the correct path.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I know we're all creatures of our own habits, but I appreciate that little bit of time. And unfortunately, during the week, man, just because of my battle rhythm during the week, I'm not really afforded that a lot. I kind of rush through my morning routine so I can get out the door and get to work as quick as possible, because my goal is to get home as quickly as I can after work, and then I have the rest of my day to do the things, right? But in there, what we're talking about though is the structure piece of it. Is, dude, if you've got an hour between events, there's things that you can do in there instead of just sitting in your office chair and scrolling on social media. Like you could read a
Right.
book. You could get up and go walk around your building for 45 minutes. Like there's a lot of things that you can get done. So it's about the self-discipline and the structure more so than it is about the act of taking a picture of your watch at 4:30 every morning.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Cass
And-
is
and I
writing down
think
some
that,
high-level
like-
question over there, I'm sure.
Yeah.
What's
I'm
that?
just take,
Cass is
taking
writing
my
down some
notes.
high-level question with a bunch of words I don't
taking
know.
my notes.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that the other part of it, and I talked about it a little bit. I appreciate you pitching my podcast on your podcast, by the way. Yeah. The
Dude,
the other part of it is like you also have to be willing to break your routine when it makes sense to do so. Because if you're a slave to the routine, it's not any better than not having one. There are goods and bads to having a routine, and if you're unwilling to break it for really good reasons, then like you're not useful to people.
Yeah.
are you saying it's
in that-
important to be flexible? Is that what you're saying?
Right, a little flexibility
Oh,
goes.
echo. Yeah.
Yep, you got to be flexible. And I think, it takes a fair amount of self-inspection too, right? Because you have to learn those things about yourself so that you can recognize, maybe what those triggers are for you, whether it's, hey, I know if this, I need this much sleep, or, if these things happen, or if this structure that I built gets interrupted for these number of days, then things start to fall off the rails. And you just got to find ways to interject it back, right? It may not be in the flow that you're used
Right.
to, but you can still buy that time back, just by being
Yeah.
organized and disciplined and having enough self-awareness around yourself to know that maybe that's what you need now. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And frankly, those things change.
Yep.
As you age or you go through different phases of your life. Like I found, for example, as I got older, if I worked out in the morning, I was more likely to hurt myself. Because my body didn't have time to like wake up and be ready
Yeah.
for the day. Which it then is like a self-defeating thing, right? Like I'm going to get up and work out, and then I hurt myself and I
Right.
can't work out. Right. And so then
That's
it,
because
like,
you're old and your
train
bones are
wrecks
That's
brittle.
the whole
right.
day, So like I can't do it first
Yeah.
thing in the
No,
morning.
there's definitely a delicate balance, man. And I think Cass and I agree on this one thing where I enjoy getting up early in the mornings. I'm usually around a 5:30, 6 o'clock kind of guy. Get up, read, coffee, kind of slow roll into the day. I really look forward to my Saturday mornings and my Sunday mornings where I can do that. This morning I read almost 100 pages of this novel that I'm in and just sat here and enjoyed peace and quiet for a little bit, a couple cups of coffee. And then my brain and my body are ready to do whatever's out there for the rest of the day and get up and go for my walk or my run or whatever it is. And now, I mean, it's still early enough. It's 10:30 here in Phoenix. So it's still early enough. I've still got the whole day
Right.
to be able to catch up on or do whatever it is I want to. The
Yeah.
important piece I want our listeners though to walk away with is that may not be for you. And you may have to actually sit down with, a clock or a calendar and write some of this stuff out and try some new things, move some of these pieces around and see what fits for you and give it a good college try, man. Don't just try it for one day and be like, well, that's fucking dumb and move on. Like try it for a week or two and see if
Right.
maybe, because it's going to be uncomfortable at first. We all know
Right.
that, it's anytime you change a routine or change a habit, it's going to be uncomfortable when you first do it. But if you give it a little bit of time, you might find that you actually really like that. I wasn't always an early riser. I've grown into that over time because I appreciate the quiet and the solitude in the mornings in my house.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah, and I think sometimes too, like for me, I like to have some time in the morning if I can, which I normally can these days, and I'm an early riser as well, but I like to have some time in the morning just to kind of cage my mindset for the day. And I've got some specific things that I look at or that I read that kind of help me get myself in the right frame of mind. But I can't always do that because sometimes I got to get up early for work and it's just, get up, shower, make coffee, and I'm out the door and I'm starting my day. But what I try to do is capture that either when I get to the hotel on a trip and just, still 30 minutes to kind of just sit down, have it be quiet, kind of reflect back on some of those things, or in the evening before bed, right? Just try to set some time aside to get that decompression time that I need, in order to get ready for what's going to be up next in the next day. So you can tinker with it.
Right.
You just got to figure out what you need and when you need it. So
yeah. And I mean, I think Cass, you have a good point, right? Like your current employer, right? Your current job probably makes it challenging to have a regularly scheduled routine, right? Just based on the fact that you're traveling and you're in different time zones and you're on slightly different schedules here and there all the time, right? And so, you know, even being adaptable, even having your schedule being adaptable to what it is, the reality of what it is that you do, and realizing that I can, kind of to Roscoe's point too, like I can find these little places to plug in the things that I know that I need to do, even if my schedule is this, you know, willy-nilly sort of
hectic and,
you know, whirlwind of differences every day, you know.
You have to know that, though. You have to know that about yourself. You have to know that these are the 5 things in my day that are non-negotiables. You know, I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to make sure I hydrate correctly and eat good meals. I'm going to make sure that I get enough rest and downtime and relaxation. You know, like one of my favorite things to do in the middle of the day is to just take 5 minutes and put my feet up on my desk, man. I just take 5 minutes. I put my feet up on my desk and I just sit there with my arms across my chest and maybe look out the window or listen to the conversations that are going around me. But that's important to me because, you know, it lets the blood flow back down to my hips instead of my ankles and gives me a chance to really kind of, I don't know, just recage in the middle of the day. And I do almost the same exact thing when I get home in the afternoons. First thing I do is I come back here, I change, I go eat, and then I might come and sit in my chair for 20 or 30 minutes with nothing, just staring at a wall, you know, and let my mind wander and see where it takes me. Cause you never know, you might come up with something creative. You might be able to solve a problem that you've been dwelling on for a little bit. So while I don't necessarily call it meditation or anything, I think it's important to take a little bit of that stoic, quiet time to yourself, you know, once or twice a day, whether it's in the morning or in the evenings, but you know, just to reflect on some of those things that are challenging us all during the day.
Yeah. And that, you know, is one of we sort of going back to something we hit on earlier with, you know, the quote, the younger generation, the kids, as it were, you know, I think that's one thing that is challenging for them, right? Frankly, is
slowing down,
as we all know, right? I mean, there's plenty of science out there that says like all of these things that we have that we carry around on these little devices, you know, are meant to be addictive, right? And so that like constant feed of
constantly searching that dopamine hit,
I got to pick it up, I got to look at it, I got to right, sort of takes away from the other things out there, like sort of just the spaced out, let your mind sort of reassemble itself and evaluate the things that it's gone through in the day and sort of put together all the pieces of the things that you've seen and heard, right? That's equally as important as anything else.
Do you ever do that with your students? Like just make them put their phones away, turn them off, and guys, we're just going to sit here in silence for like 5 minutes. And because I'd be curious to see, I'd be curious to watch their faces and see who's going to break and go like nuts.
You know, frankly, a lot of times they're actually really stubborn people, and so they're pretty capable of outlasting you if you're just going to have a stare down.
Just as a point of order,
right? like they're just as competitive as you are, right? And so like if you make the challenge, if you overtly make the challenge of we're just going to have a stare down, like the odds of you losing that
pretty high.
It's a toss up, right? Like,
well, maybe you give them a point to ponder or something like, guys, you know, put everything away. Here's a point to ponder, and in 5 minutes we're going to discuss.
Yeah, and I do that a lot, right? I try to break the class up a little bit, right? And some days are just a lot of download of information on my part, right? Like, hey, here's context that you need to know. Most of the time I try to make a discussion like, hey, what did you take away from the things that we read for this day or whatever, you know, and then sometimes I break them up into individual or small groups or whatever and have them contemplate on the various things that we talked about, right? And then come back and kind of report to the class of what it is. But I do make it an effort to sort of close it down, close your screens up, right? Like put those away, and let's just like have real live human interaction to the max extent possible.
That's something I think we're a lot of us miss the forest for the trees when it comes to that, man. Is you know, I know we've beat this dead horse a lot, but that basic human need of connection, you know, and
Yeah, we're
and
hardwired
how
for it.
cool is it? Like, yeah, how cool is it? Like, you know, Cass and I went to lunch not too long ago, and for the first hour, we just sat there and talked, man. There was no
Yeah.
distractions. There was no, you know, text messaging or listening to the bings and boops off of your phone or whatever it was. We just sat there and had a conversation, and it was good. It's
Yeah.
one of my favorite things, man. I wish that the younger crowd, the younger listeners, could get to this point where just I actually gave this advice to my son just a few days ago. He's going through a pretty challenging time in his personal life right now, and I said, dude, I texted him this ironically. Hey, man, one of the things that always helps me get through some of these things is getting out in nature, right? Go for a run, go for a walk around the lake, go sit on a rock and just listen to the wind for a little bit, you know, and you'd be surprised at how calming and soothing that is. And eventually, if you give it a long enough time, it kind of allows your brain to get around some of these, you know, more complex topics or these challenges that you're facing. Nature is a really good healer for us, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I had a friend of ours who she says, you know, you got to go to the mountains or to the beach every once in a while and just like see the power of that, right?
Yeah.
And feel sort of how insignificant you are in many ways to like really recenter yourself. And I think that's totally true, right? Like you gotta experience that.
Makes you feel
that
small
magnitude
sometimes,
a
doesn't
little
it?
bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stand on top of a mountain and you know, look back on your journey to get there and just realize how insignificant you really are
Yeah.
sometimes, man.
Right.
In the grand
Yeah.
scheme, man, you're a tiny dot.
Yeah. Which is part of the reason why, you know, we talked about my podcast is not current. I hadn't run an episode in a while, you know, and it was just like you talked about, right? It was like I had to get a break from it just because the effort of doing it, right? Like the mental effort of doing it sort of day in and day or weekly, I guess, you know, and like the amount of time that it was consuming in my life to be able to do that, right? I just
Yeah.
needed to unplug from that for a hot minute to be able to like reset and rethink and come back, right? Because I'm afraid of making it not useful to people anymore. And the way that it started, sort of like you were talking about with your son, is like I had in the same day I had two things happen. One was I had folks in my class here tell me like, hey, you should do a podcast where you give like 7 minutes on some historical topic. And the reason why the class that we were in was covering a lot of like really high level stuff, very like esoteric things about strategy and stuff. But I found myself like having to give them little lectures on like, you know, how did the Arab-Israeli wars get to where they are? Like what, you know, what's, you know, what was the U.S. strategy in the Pacific during World War II, whatever, right? Like, and I had to give them like, you know, 8 minutes on Eastern Europe, you know, whatever. And so they found that to be really interesting. And, you know, one day I was giving, in fact, it was about the Arab-Israeli wars. It was like 8 minutes on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And they were like, you should do a podcast about that. And then that same day, my older son, who's in college, called me and you know, kind of like you were talking about, Roscoe. He was like, how do I do some of these life things, right? Like how do I balance my schedule? How do I do these things that you're talking about? What's the fighter pilot answer for those things? And so then we had this conversation, you know, over the course of 30 minutes or an hour about how I balance my day and that kind of stuff. And he was like, you should do a podcast about that. And I said, well, all right. So now I have two parts of, you know, like 2 times in one day, somebody told me, and that's how it's sort of a weird mashup, right? But it's sort of like how my day goes, right? Is I spend a lot of time thinking about those 2 topics.
No, I'm giggling over here because I can just see Cass getting a little chubby over there because that's the whole reason we started the Be One Change One show was we thought that we were going to target that younger demographic and share with them all this awesome knowledge that we've gained over these years of, you know, flying fast jets, breaking stuff and killing people. But what we've really found, dude, and I'd be interested to see what your stats are on your show. What we've really found, though, is it's everywhere from 16, 17 years old up to 70 years old. People are grooving on this stuff, man, because, you know, I think it's something that everyone can take a little bit of something away from.
Yeah.
you know, and not every episode
Applicable to all
of
phases
either
of
of our
life.
shows, not every. Yeah, not every episode is pertinent and applies to maybe your specific thing, and I'll give you that. But something in here, somebody is going to be challenged with one of these topics. Somebody is we have listeners who listen to one or two shows here and there. We have listeners who listen to every show. And you know, it's the idea that we're helping someone by sharing. What really got us to the point was we were talking about how sad would it be if we took all of this to our graves and never shared it with anyone.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
and that's really where it came from. So I can appreciate what you're doing, man. And if you've got that younger generation hanging on to those things, dude, I say expand it. I say make it bigger. Make those sections of your podcast bigger, and try to hit on some of these things that we know that this younger generation is challenged with.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. That's
Yeah,
good
man.
to know.
No, I think you're doing a good job, man. You're doing good work out there.
I'll tell a funny story real quick about this. You were talking about the range of people that might listen, and one of the groups of people. So my mother-in-law lives in a small town in Mississippi, and she plays bridge. And so one day, I got a call from her, and she was in the car, like going to play bridge, and she was carpooling with a bunch of people, and they had just listened to like one of the episodes of my podcast, and they had a ton of questions about like, and so they were like, tell us about this. Like, I want to know more about this thing.
The cackling old hens at the bridge game.
Right. Exactly. I got the bridge ladies, super fired up about whatever it was we were talking about that day. But, I think there's always a place to learn, and I often joke that like the internet is now like is now as good of a mentor as almost anything else, right? Because if you want to learn to do something, right, there's a YouTube channel about anything.
Well, what's cool about
and I mean it's in a good way, right? Like that. I mean, there you can learn a lot of stuff.
What's cool
just by putting it in Google.
What's cool about that story for you too, though, Meta, is because we talk on the podcast all the time about like you got to keep your eyes open for opportunity, right? Because it may not be. Like opportunity doesn't just fall in your lap. It may not, and there may be some effort involved in creating that opportunity, right? And the fact that you saw, you can even remember that day and go, hey, there was this, and then there was this, and out of that, you decided to create this opportunity to move into a podcast. That's cool, man. Because you never know where those things are going to go, and I'm sure that you learn things through that process, right? Even though that you've got it on pause right now. There's probably some really good skills that you picked up or some things that you learned in that process that maybe have even helped you be a little bit of a professor and an instructor and all those types of things, right? So it's always it's that self-continuing improvement process that you're going through, which is awesome, dude.
For sure. Thank you.
Yeah, man. Dude, keep up the good work over there, man. The Air Force is in good hands with people like you up there. And I know it's not for everybody, but for those few who get exposed to some of these things that we talk about, man, it's fun to just sit back and wait, right? Because eventually this shit'll set in for them. I was having a conversation with my 22-year-old yesterday about, hey man, life is giving you an opportunity to learn a really good lesson right now. And if you take the time and sit and dwell on it and actually learn this, you're going to be so much better off. If you don't, you're going to get another opportunity. It may be in 2 years, it may be in 5 years, it may be in 10 years, but life has this way of they're going to keep throwing fastballs until you connect with one, man. Until you figure it out, you're going to keep getting this. So I appreciate what you're doing out there, man. Thanks for being a guest.
Yeah, and we got to have you back on, Meta, to do like
keep up the good work.
We got to have you back on, brother, and we'll just do a current events and historical context episode. That would be fun.
Yeah.
I'm
always down for that.
Let you rip.
Yeah.
I'll just hit cold mic on that one and let you guys go poli-sci and nerd out on strategy and stuff like that.
I'm curious before we run though, what are you guys reading right now? What's on your mind?
As far as
fiction or nonfiction?
Either one.
Cass, go ahead.
What did I just finished up a book, Adam Grant. God, what was the title though? I can't remember it off the top of my head because I've read so many.
It wasn't that Hidden Potential,
not
was
Hidden
it?
Potential. It's a something brain. I can't remember what it is. I don't know why the title's is evading me right now. But really good read. Yeah.
Nice. I've read a few of his things. I really do like him. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I went down this. I got a little burned out on some of the non-fictional self-help, productivity kind of thing. So I took a big step back from that, starting in probably about May of this year. And I've got 2 books remaining in the entire Vince Flynn Mitch Rapp series.
Oh, hey.
So I've been collecting them. Him and Brad Thor and Mark Graney are kind of my faves in that genre. And I've been slowly collecting them over the years. And Katie went to this used book convention or something. It was down at the fairgrounds here in Phoenix. You have to pay $25 to get in. She took her suitcase down there, her rolling suitcase, and came back with like 50 books.
Oh,
and
wow.
Oh yeah, and they're all like $3-4 a piece. All the proceeds go to a charity. It's really awesome. But I was able to get the entire 23 book series off of that, and I actually just bought his brand new one, written by Don something. I can't remember now. But Kyle Mills is no longer writing for Vince Flynn. He's turned it over to someone else.
Nice.
Don Bentley, that's who it was. And
awesome.
Yeah, so I got 2 more left in that, and then I don't know what the fuck I'm going to do with my life, because I've been living in this Mitch Rapp universe for so long that I'm going to be listless for a while.
Yeah. Think Again was the
What
title.
about you? What are you
Think Again
into?
Was the title, Meta. Yeah.
Think Again.
Think Again is the title.
Think Again. Yeah. I just finished that. I started doing audiobooks a lot. On my drive to and from work, and like when I'm getting ready to go to bed and that kind of stuff. Because I find that I read a lot during the day at work. And so like, I don't have a lot of time to read other than that.
Yeah.
So I stole this idea from my wife. I'm going to give her full credit for this. She started doing a thing where she went back and read a bunch of classics like Dracula and stuff like that. And so I've kind of copycatted her a little bit, and I started doing that, and I'm currently reading Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, which I hadn't done since high school, and this is one of the things. This is why I
need to read 1984 again.
I feel like sometimes you have to go back and revisit things that you've read before, because you change, like your perspective on life changes, and then you go back and you read a book and it changes, right? So. That's what I'm reading right now, and I'm not usually a big nonfiction reader. Obviously, because of the things that I do, I read a lot of fiction. I'm usually a nonfiction reader, not a fiction reader.
Right.
This is a little unusual for me.
I agree with Cass, man. I actually was staring at 1984 on my bookshelf the other day, and I almost picked it up, but Sucka, you and I will talk offline about some things here in a little bit, and I'll tell you why I didn't pick that up, but. I actually did just download. Brian Kilmeade put out a book 3 or 4 years ago about the Culper spy ring, Washington's spy rings in the Revolutionary War, and I downloaded that on Audible. I'm going to start listening to that one this week.
Yeah, that one's really good.
Yeah,
that one's really good.
Yeah.
All right,
man. Cass, what you got, man?
Else, man?
Anything else?
Be the change.
All right, brother.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
All right, we'll see you guys.
See you.
Thanks for flying with the Be One Change One podcast. If you got something out of this show, then be the one and share it in your circles of influence.
You can be our wingman through our website at www.be1change1.com. That's B and the number 1, change and the number 1.com.
We invite you to be the one and join our fighter squadron on social media at Be1Change1 on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. You can follow us at Paul Roscoe White on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, as well as Roscoe's website, www.paulroscoewhite.com.
You can email us from the website, and please leave comments, share, and ask questions, or leave ideas of things you would like to discuss on future podcasts. Most importantly, be the one that helps us win the algorithm by leaving a review on whatever platform you're listening on.
Thanks for joining. Until next time, be the one.